For this edition of Now Age Conversations, I'm speaking with John Stauber. Hey, John.
Hey, Craig. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. John is a journalist and author, founder and former executive director of Center for Media and Democracy. Also a regular contributor to Counterpunch, and your most recent column, which I'm going to link to. People should read: The Rise and Fall of Obamacare. Will the inside story ever be told? Which is quite interesting. If people were following the story of the whistleblower Wendell Potter and your connections with him there, and what you bring, I didn't know any of that. So it's worthwhile reading for people. You just want to get behind the story, and I guess what we're talking about now is post-election propaganda, which seems to be much. The propaganda. Since the last time we spoke, the propaganda just seems to be piling on and piling on and piling on, such that I wrote in my piece this week, discerning fake news from propaganda. We have Pizzagate versus Russiagate. And maybe we could get a little bit into that. I mean, it seems like the mainstream media is all over Pizzagate. Hillary came out and spoke about Pizzagate, and then the Russiagate thing. But the propaganda part of it is that how the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Guardian all pushed WMD in Iraq to much more far devastating consequences than anything happened with or could have ever happened with Pizzagate. And this is what we have with the propaganda. So we get into a little bit of that and how this stuff sort of takes hold, and how this important stuff sort of just goes into the forgetter. They just make sure it goes into the forgetter.
Well, back in 1995, I wrote my first book on propaganda, which is titled Toxic Sludge is Good for You, and which I'm happy to see is still selling quite well for our publisher, Common Courage Press. And the funny thing about propaganda is people in the United States are conditioned to believe that we don't have propaganda, that propaganda exists in Putin's Russia or Saddam's Iraq or anywhere but here in the U.S., or if there is propaganda, it's those other guys we don't like. If you're for Trump, it's all Hillary's propaganda. If you're for Hillary, it's all Trump's propaganda. But the bottom line is that the news media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, NPR, name your favorite, is the largest single source of propaganda in the United States. And what is propaganda? Propaganda is simply the effort to manipulate people's perceptions and opinions and behavior without them knowing they're being manipulated. In fact, it's best if your propaganda resonates with the bias that people already have. So we have these echo chambers. People who identify as political progressives in the U.S., they read Alternate, The Nation, Mother Jones, Common Dreams, whatever. The people who go, well, I'm not that far left, I'm more liberal, they cling to the New York Times. People in various stages on the right read, Breitbart or something more traditional. And so we're constantly choosing to bathe ourselves in propaganda that reinforces our biases. And I think a really big issue with this current blow-up about whose propaganda cost whom which election is that the American public especially does not know how to think critically and discern the difference between facts, and yes, there are facts, and come to some sort of honest conclusion about what's true. And that's because we're not supposed to be able to do that. We're supposed to be susceptible to propaganda, and we are. So here we have this bizarre situation where now, as we're speaking, the election has apparently ended with Donald Trump winning the Electoral College and Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote, which plus 25 cents will buy you a half a pack of bubble gum, because America's built on Electoral College decisions as to who wins the presidential election. And today, and I realize this interview will be dated, but I think it's important to note these things. Today, when I wake up, I look at the news and see that the Hillary team wants her colleague Obama's CIA to brief the Electoral College before they decide whether to give the election to the Electoral College winner, Donald Trump, or say, oh my God, Putin stole the election. The CIA told us so. We're going to steal it back. And we see the New York Times and the Washington Post and everyone jumping on this leaked CIA information and the bizarre situation where the FBI is sort of holding back. The FBI is being accused of essentially being weaponized by Putin. Nate Silver, the guru on elections and who's going to win and how did they win, saying, yeah, it was Comey's announcement the week before the election that Anthony Weiner had a bunch of Hillary's emails that really swung it to Trump. It's crazy. I mean, if you wrote this script for Hollywood, they'd say, come on, we need a little more reality in this story. We're not buying this one. And of course, what goes unexamined, not just the biases of the big media operations like the Washington Post and the New York Times, which are owned by billionaires like Carlos Slim and which are neoliberal institutions of capitalist propaganda. But hey, how do you win an election? Well, you only win an election if you're one of the parties supported by the billionaires, either the Democrats or Republicans, and then you take the money from your billionaires and you pour it into what? Propaganda, advertising. You know, if you want to say what propaganda is most responsible for twisting the minds of the American public and causing them to vote against their own interests and choose a candidate who's not in their interests, you'd have to say it's the propaganda bought by the candidates themselves with billionaires' money to air propaganda advertising on television. So part of the problem with even trying to have a conversation about propaganda in the United States is that the American public is so well propagandized to believe we don't have propaganda, when, in fact, as academics like Alex Carey and others who've investigated propaganda have always pointed out, and ironically, as a reporter with Russia Today pointed out, it is the West, it is the United States, it is us who are the victims of the most insidious and hidden propaganda because we believe the myth of the objective news media. And then when somebody points out, oh, the news media is filled with propaganda, people get outraged. Who put that propaganda in the news media? Well, the news media lives on propaganda. In fact, most of what the American news media reports as news is a result of somebody's PR or propaganda campaign. And as I pointed out with the Center for Media and Democracy now a decade ago, TV news is filled with the most outrageous fake news where public relations firms create what looks like a news story, give it to a TV station, and they say, okay, we like this little pitch for your product or whatever it is, and we're going to air it as if it's real news. And so TV itself is filled with what's supposed to look like journalism and is fake news given to them by a PR firm working for a corporation or some other powerful interest. So when we start talking about propaganda and who stole the election, every election is stolen by propaganda. The propaganda is paid for by the richest people. And when I think of this charge that, oh, Putin or some evil force hacked into the Democrats and hacked into John Podesta and revealed all these emails, I say, well, whoever did this, thank you. Because one thing we do know is that the emails are factual. And one thing we do know is that democratic elections in the United States are not democratic. It's all farce and charade manipulated by the richest. You want to find out? Read those hacked emails. Whoever provided those emails, even if it was Putin, and there's no conclusive evidence of that. In fact, now I'm enjoying hearing people like John Bolton for God's sake, say, oh, maybe it was a false flag operation and Obama and Hillary stayed, come on. We probably never know for sure who the heck released all those emails, but I'm thankful they did, because that's how the system really operates. You want to know who's screwing who, read the emails that were leaked by WikiLeaks. Where did they come from? We don't know. Are they factually accurate? Yeah, that's the biggest consensus. Those emails are factually accurate. When John Podesta is in an email chain indicating that Bernie Sanders was working with Hillary to pull punches way back in the spring of 2015, that's really good evidence for me, who's written about this, that Bernie never really intended to upset the apple cart. He just wanted to shake it a little and then jump on it because he was with the Democrats and Hillary all along. That's one of the biggest stories in this election. You've reported on it. I've reported on it. So give me a break, folks. Propaganda, yeah, we are bathed in it. It's like shit on a pig in a sty. We are covered with it. It stinks, but it's perfumed. So the trick, if you're really going to discern what's real, is to see the propaganda. Hey, maybe you voted for Trump, okay? Well, Trump's propaganda sticks all over you. Hey, maybe you voted for Hillary, okay? Well, Hillary's propaganda sticks all over you. If you really want to be an independent thinker, realize that and figure it out. Vote for whomever you want to vote, or don't vote at all, because as you and I and many others have pointed out, the system is indeed rigged. Only the two parties owned by the billionaire class ever has a chance of winning. So this is indeed, the most bizarre, colorful, disturbing, frightening, fill in your additional adjectives, election of my lifetime. And I've lived long enough to see, the mafia give John F. Kennedy his victory in 1960, and the lying, cheating Richard Nixon win in 68 and 72, and the Reagan Revolution in 80. But this is indeed the most bizarre, because it's given us a candidate that 99% of the American political punditry and media said could never be elected president, and that's Donald Trump. And love him or hate him, that's the most important story, that Trump is the president of the United States. Now, if Hillary's CIA figures out a way to convince the electors that Putin weaponized Comey and the FBI, and that's the only reason Trump is president, and the Electoral College, gives it to somebody who doesn't want it, like Kasich or whatever, then this whole story just gets more and more bizarre. But bottom line, folks, is propaganda is being used as a weapon by the propagandists to convince you that their side has the truth. The truth is something we all have to sort out and decide for ourselves, because the bottom line is we are all bathed in propaganda, and the biggest single source is the mainstream U.S. media.
Yeah. So I've had people remark to me and friends of mine who haven't been paying attention, we'll say, for the past 30 or so years to current events, as to where to go now to find the right information. What do I read? What do I do? I said, and my answer is, if you haven't been paying attention and developing a sense of discernment, you can't just pick one up, at the corner store, and when we talk about an actual experience that somebody has versus a mediated experience, which is what the media presents to you, what is that missing ingredient that people are so easily bamboozled? And then some people just know. I mean, I knew there weren't WMD in Iraq. I mean, I didn't have to go there to figure out, but I knew in my gut that I was being played. And some people were played. In fact, some important people were played. So, what's the distinction there?
Well, first of all, this idea that there's a source you can go to that will hand you the truth is a myth. It's a total and complete myth. All journalism, all reporters, all media has a bias or an opinion, some much worse than others, because they're simply fronts for big money interests. When I read stories about Mexico or the drug trade or whatever in the New York Times, I have to stop and remind myself that the biggest billionaire, the media billionaire Carlos Slim, the Mexican, has poured billions into the New York Times. So do you think that colors their coverage at all? Well, of course it does. The New York Times sold us the war in Iraq more than anyone else. How did they do that? Because they claim to be the opposition press. They claim to be the liberal voice of reason. They claim not to be part of the run-up to every war that an American president and Congress wants to get into without declaring it. And they had to be complete blind idiots, thieves, or worse to do what they did, which is take CIA propaganda provided to the disgraced journalist Judith Miller and put it all over their front page. I say the disgraced journalist Judith Miller, actually she still has a very nice life and was elevated when she spent some jail time for protecting her sources. So, but the real crime of weapons of mass deception in the media was when the New York Times took CIA propaganda provided by a CIA front group called the Iraqi National Congress over and over and over and printed it on the front page with proof that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. 100% of those people who came forward with evidence turned out to be frauds. 100% of the evidence turned out to be fake. And yet that really was the final linchpin loosened in letting the U.S. unleash this war, which has resulted in ISIS and probably 1 million people dead in Iraq and the Middle East because of it, and created a situation which just gets worse. The first thing Obama did, actually it was prior to his first thing because it was before his inauguration, the first important act he took, I believe it was in December of 2008, was to announce there would be no investigation of the massive, fraudulent, disastrous propaganda campaign that lied the United States into attacking Iraq. Why? Because while the Democrats loved to hang it on George Bush, it was bipartisan. It could have never happened if people like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and John Kerry and complete your list of Democratic senators hadn't bought into it and promoted it. They knew it was a pile of BS, even though they won't admit they knew, they knew. So yeah, again, the worst propaganda comes through the mainstream media. And then years later, sometimes decades later, people will go, now I get it. But they still fall victim to the current propaganda, which, as we're talking, is this massive assault on the concept that Trump won the election because of Putin. And in fact, if you look at the Democrats and what they're claiming, everyone was at fault for Trump's being elected president except Hillary and the Democrats, who were blameless.
Right. Well, that's interesting. You get that because you mentioned that when Obama came in, did not want to look backward, that whole thing. We're going to look forward. Now Trump coming in, we're not going to look backward at prosecuting Hillary's email. We're just going to look forward. But we also have, friends and journalists on the left who are so in terror of Trump, or also want to avoid talking about what led up to Trump, which I think is an important part of the story, which is not just the Clintons, the Democrats, the liberals, but neoliberalism itself. The concept of neoliberalism. I did a search in the New York Times website, and I came up with 2 opinion pieces where they actually mentioned neoliberalism. And that's it. When you want to talk about propaganda, you want to talk about an organizing system that has ripped the guts out of this country and probably the rest of the world. It's this neoliberalism system of economics, government, whatever, however you want to phrase it, and how the Democratic Party is bought into it. They sold working class voters down the river. There's a great piece in The Atlantic by Matt Stauber called How Democrats Killed Their Popular Soul. I don't know if you just saw it. I'm going to link to it. But I really get into how in the 74 election, congressional election, how that brought forth these, what he called Watergate babies, and how they were against corruption in the White House or the administration. They were against the war. but they had no problem with Wall Street and banking. And that was sort of the birth of it. And then, of course, came Carter, deregulation. Then, of course, Reagan. And then of course, Clinton, Bush, Obama, of course. So can you talk a little bit about what neoliberalism is and how they've been so successful in keeping this phrase from public consciousness and how dangerous it is?
And I enjoyed your timeline there. And I think an important addition to that timeline is the rise of Hillary and Bill Clinton and the Democratic Leadership Council or Conference, who came forward in the 1980s, and really they were the final nail in the coffin of this Democratic Party that people like John Nichols and others like to reflect upon. That is so old now. It was so long ago that most of the people who played any role in a progressive or populist Democratic Party are geriatric or dead. The Clintons came along and they looked at what had happened. They looked at how, you want to talk about a stolen election, Nixon and the news media, by ignoring Watergate and by whitewashing Nixon's crimes, destroyed a real left populist in the Democratic Party, George McGovern. And then in 76, sort of populism light comes in with Jimmy Carter, and he's a one-termer. And then the massive Reagan revolution, unprecedented until the Trump revolution that we're now just seeing, comes along. And what did the Democrats learn? The big money Democrats like Clinton, one of the young people probably in Matt Stoller's story, or an heir to that, he and his wife say, hey, if our Democratic Party is going to rise again, we have to become like the Republicans. We have to go corporate. We have to go for the corporate money. We have to align with this massive wealth-producing machine of our democratic capitalist establishment. We have to welcome this into our party. We have to sell our party to big money interests, which is what they did, and which I think lends special irony to the fact that Trump, who I completely disdain, as I disdain Hillary and Bill, rode this wave of right-wing populism into office, but of course he is the epitome of the billionaire oligarch. People are always manipulating populism and trying to deal with it because it's the biggest threat there is to what you call neoliberalism. And so you've got to deal with populism, which is simply the desire of people to have a good life and have government that's honest and accountable and be given an opportunity to shape their future. I mean, left populism is sort of my politics, which is just democracy, the belief that people have a right to own and control our government. And those are some of the finest ideals that the country, with all its warts, was founded upon. The term neoliberalism doesn't appear in the mainstream media because the mainstream media is one of the most important parts of the neoliberal establishment. The mainstream media is owned by giant corporations, and there are very few corporations that own that media, and they're funded by other corporations so that they can broadcast and protect their propaganda. If you look at TV media, just look at the advertising. Where do those ads come from? The biotech industry, the oil industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry, the alcohol industry, the car industry. That's all propaganda. And people say, well, yeah, but it's advertising, so we're not fooled by it. That's another interview. The bottom line is all those billions flow into the media, and so the media, the neoliberal corporate media, is the main means of delivering the propaganda mindwash, the consumerism, which undergirds neoliberalism and gets people thinking that we really have to buy into the system because ultimately I'll win a lottery ticket, or ultimately my kid will develop a computer app that'll make me a Bill Gates, and this system works for me. If the mainstream media ever started to pick apart why are average people and the environment and honest politics so screwed by the system, it would have to start at picking itself apart and looking at how it works to deliver the brainwash propaganda that undergirds this neoliberal system. So you'll never see the New York Times or MSNBC or NPR really do something on neoliberalism unless somehow it does begin to enter the popular mindset and popular debate, and then they'll begin to cover it, but of course in a way that protects neoliberalism. And what is neoliberalism? For me, neoliberalism is a system that continuously makes the super rich richer at the expense of average people, the poor, the planet, democracy, fairness, but covers it up by using its massive mainstream propaganda to convince people that this is just the way it is. This is the best system on earth. And so now we see neoliberalism in the US reaching back into its bag of tricks and pulling out a viral anti-communism. You know, it's ironic you don't see the word communist used to smear Putin, because technically Putin's Russia is not a communist system anymore, right? Communism collapsed, and in the mythology it was collapsed by, you know, the great Archangel Ronald Reagan, who yelled out, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, and suddenly a brutal system of oppression gave way to democracy. Oops, it gave way to Putinism. And now Putinism is as demonized as communism was. And for you and me and other people old enough to remember what it was like growing up under anti-communism, which undergirded the predecessor to neoliberalism, it was horrific. You know, if you said one thing wrong, one thing good about a union member, one thing bad about a horrible U.S. war of genocide like the war in Vietnam, totally unnecessary, killing 3 to 4 million Vietnamese, you know, a war best defined by the book title, Kill Anything That Moves. No, at the time, if you spoke out against that, you were helping the communists. As Richard Nixon said, anti-war protesters were the strongest weapon of the communists themselves. And just that word communism, you know, would send chill up the spine of people, however you felt about it. So neoliberalism is our current problem, but we're not seeing a critique of it. And I like to critique the left, because what I've said very publicly for quite a while now, and especially in an essay I wrote in Counterpunch in 2013, what I've said is that the progressive movement that we think is actually all wonderful and all left populism and all going to save us from neoliberalism and certainly save us from the horrors of Trump is itself an instrument of liberal billionaires like Tom Steyer and George Soros and others. If you want to find out where this grand conspiracy lurks, just Google Democracy Alliance, one word, you know, or Google my name and Democracy Alliance, or Counterpunch and Democracy Alliance. You know, the so-called independent progressive media, and these are the people who are my friends and who I prefer and who I enjoy because we think so much alike on so many things. They're feeding at a trough of money provided by people who most support Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton has never had a bigger supporter than George Soros, one of the founders of the Democracy Alliance. And George Soros and John Podesta and the Democracy Alliance, you know, funneled millions and millions of dollars. And by the way, they're funneling millions and millions more now under the title of Let's Fight Back Against Trump to progressive organizations and progressive media, you know, The Nation, Alternate, Mother Jones, Move On, they all, Democracy Now!, they all submit their proposals to Democracy Alliance and Democracy Alliance funders to do the wonderful work. Now it will be exposing Trump. But the bottom line is their bread comes from billionaires, neoliberal billionaires,
who exact a price every 2 years and when there's an election, and they exact a price in the interim. And that price is go easy on the Democrats and just focus that firepower on the Republicans because they're the real problem. So we have this neoliberal system in the United States with two political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. But it's one neoliberal oligarchy. The richest billionaires do well under both parties. If you notice, right now, the stock market is booming under Trump's election. Who did Wall Street want? They wanted Hillary. She was the preferred known commodity. But they can do very well under Trump. And so you see, Hollywood millionaires, people like Natalie Portman, now suddenly saying, and she's not the only one, there are many, saying, maybe Trump will be okay, because they're realizing their money isn't going to disappear under Trump. Whether it's Trump, whether it's Clinton, the billionaires win. Wall Street wins. And so this huge push to demonize Trump, to elect Democrats, the progressive media is filled now with money. And if you want to become rich right now, the best way to become rich is to start an organization that's going to trash Trump. And then turn to the Podestas and the Brocks and the Democracy Alliance crowd and say, hey, we're going to expose Trump. Give us some money to do it. And go to the public and say, hey, we're going to expose Trump. Give us money to do this. It's all becoming a sham. And it's almost impossible for honest journalism to prevail anymore, because these outlets that progressives are conditioned to trust in our echo chamber are also funded by neoliberal billionaires. And do they overtly promote Clinton? Not that much. Do they overtly promote Soros and Wall Street? No, not that much. But do they just rain hellfire down on Trump and the GOP? Absolutely. Do they scare the bejeebers out of everyone thinking Trump is the reincarnation of Hitler, and that allowing Trump to be president is going to undermine all that's good and has ever happened in this country and lead to Armageddon? Yes, that's what they do. And does all the money they get and depend upon from the billionaire neoliberals help them do that? Absolutely. So, the propaganda on the left is really as bad as the propaganda on the right, because it's not really left. It's progressive, which means it's funded by Democratic billionaires to look left, but always support the Democratic candidates, always go light on the Democratic Party, and just wail away on the Republicans.
So what is a hopeful, discerning citizen to do going forward now in this, President Trump era? Because certainly I don't believe the Electoral College is going to go against him and vote him out. I believe he's going to be inaugurated and he will be president. I don't see any kind of Hillary covert CIA thing happening here. And
what is trying?
Yeah.
They are trying.
He's trying. Yeah. What are people to do? I mean, the people feel really disempowered. They feel really scared, and what happens is that they go back to Wolf Blitzer and Rachel Maddow and their trusted nighttime sort of TV teddy bears.
Right. Well, they are disempowered, and if they thought they were empowered, they were illusioned, and now hopefully people will become disillusioned. Disillusionment is ultimately a good thing. We need to see through the illusions to get to reality, and the bottom line for me is a hashtag I use. It's the oligarchy, stupid. Ripping off the old Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid, which he used to get elected. And what he meant was, as long as the neoliberal economy is booming, you'll probably get elected and reelected if you're on its side. But fundamentally, people have to come to the grips with the fact that, we are disempowered. That, as my friend and former colleague Wendell Potter says in his new journalism enterprise, Tarbell, the rich own politics. You know, that's the lesson Wendell learned when he came out of being an insurance industry flack and trying to influence politics and the whole Obamacare fiasco. The rich own the political system. They own the Democrats and Republicans. So what people have to do is really, you know, gird our belts and understand that it's up to us as individuals, it's up to us as individuals in a community organizing and working together, and it's up to us to see through our own feel-good echo chambers and propaganda. Because Move On or John Podesta or David Brock or John Nichols writing in The Nation, they are not our saviors. They are our herders, as Bernie was a herder, herding us into the Democratic Party. You know, I've criticized Jill Stein for her recount, what Trump calls it a scam, but her exploitation of the recount to raise maybe $10 million from terrified Hillary voters and create a mailing list. It really didn't accomplish much. She's out there saying we have to do this recount or people will lose faith in the integrity of our electoral system. No one should have faith in the integrity of our electoral system because, as I've been hammering away, it's owned by oligarchs. And Jill Stein, of all people, should know this best of all. She calls the Greens a third party. They're not a third party. You can't be a third party when you can only win 1 or 2 or 3% of the vote. And I think it was closer to 1% this year because the whole system is rigged to keep you out of the debates. Don't give us this BS, Jill Stein, of how your mission is to preserve the people's faith in the integrity of a system that we should be tearing down the two-party oligarchy. That's really what we have to do. You know, it's a monopoly. It's a monopoly of the billionaires. Some of the billionaires smoke pot and are concerned about the environment. Other billionaires go to church and just hope the whole thing shit cans so they can get to God in heaven. They're the billionaires. They benefit whichever party wins. And it's the oligarchy, it's the neoliberal oligarchy. We have to focus on that, and we have to go back to our roots. And the minute we think there's a simple solution that somebody has the truth or some savior on a white horse is going to come along and lead us to the promised land, then we really are screwed. And there is no easy answer here. There is no easy fix. There is no revolution in our lifetime, as many of my progressive friends seem to urge as they, you know, point our fingers towards the Democratic lever in the voting booth. Yeah, one thing that excited me in this election, actually, although it pissed off a lot of the Greens, was when Jill Stein turned to Bernie Sanders and said, hey, I have a spot on almost all the states' ballots. And the ones where we aren't don't really matter because the electoral system, the electoral college prevails. And join me. You can be running for president of the United States on the Green Party ticket. And of course, Bernie would never do that because he was more devoted to the Democratic Party than anyone. But had he done that, then we would have seen some fireworks. And it might now be Trump and Hillary banded together trying to prevent the electoral college from anointing Bernie Sanders as president. Because the one really truth in this election is that we all know we're screwed. The majority of us know we're screwed, and we're desperately trying to figure out what's the way out of here. Populism of the right allowed Trump to rise. Populism of the left allows Sanders to rise. Unlike Sanders, Trump had the chutzpah and the billions to keep pushing. Sanders could have been a player had he really believed in and respected the populism he promoted. But now he's left with this stinking carcass of a Democratic Party, and he's the guy who's going to, quote unquote, reform it. And we should all be working through his organizations like Our Revolution and Brand New Congress to fill it back up with air so it can float again by 2012. No, oligarchs own the party. So there's actually, if you pick through the trash and the rubble and the other disgusting stuff, there's really some good signs here. One is that most people didn't vote or voted for somebody not named Trump or Clinton. People know we're screwed, but being able to find our voices, being able to find the political leaders who can really unite us and take us to places where we can overthrow this neoliberal oligarchy are few and far between. We know it's not Trump, it's not Clinton. It's also not Bernie, because he's pushing everything back into the Democratic Party. And apparently it's not the Greens and Jill Stein, because she's trying to raise money for recounts to restore our faith in a rotten, stinking system.
There you go. Well, this has been great, John. A lot of good information. Make sure we link to your pieces in Counterpunch, your recent piece, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks a lot, Craig, and thanks for all the work you do.
Thanks. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.